everybody. Okay, I think I am finally up and live. Sorry, I couldn't find my phone stand this morning, so I've been running around like crazy. I had everything ready for our quilt class, but the stand for the recorder. So here we go. I am a little bit sad, okay, kind of a lot sad that we're not together in the same room sewing up our community quilt blocks and talking and visiting. But this is the second best thing I could think of, so here we go. Let's talk about how to make a Courthouse Steps quilt block. I've got some examples here to show you, and we'll talk kind of about where they came from, how they turned into being a popular quilt block, and then I will walk you through how to make one. So I've got a couple examples right here. So this is a Courthouse Steps block. So this is one that I made a while ago, and this is the size of the quilt blocks for our community quilt. Down at City Hall, there is some, oh darn it, I didn't bring my sheet over with me. We've got some handouts that'll walk you through how to make these, but I'm kind of thinking the City Hall buildings are closed right now. I will also put a link to step-by-step instructions at the end of this post. I'll just go put it in the comments. So you'll have kind of like some step-by-steps on how to make a Courthouse step block, exactly like the one I'm making right now. So this is the exact size of the one that we're gonna make. It starts in the middle. We're gonna start in the middle, and then we're gonna work our way out. On each side, we're gonna go in the middle, side to side, up and down, side to side, up and down. It's super, super simple to create one of these. So here's one example. Here is another example. These are going to go in the same quilt. So you can see I kind of used coordinating fabrics for those. You don't need to use coordinating fabrics. One of the great things about Courthouse Steps is one of the great things also about log cabins, which we'll talk about later today, is that they're really perfect for scrappy looking quilts. So you don't need to have any of your fabrics match. You don't need to have any of them coordinate. I like to coordinate. That's why the ones I just showed you coordinate, but you don't have to. Here's another example. This one's giant. This is not the size that we're going to make today. This is a giant one. Kind of let you see here. It's humongous. We're not going to make one quite that big today. It's one that was joined together as part of a really big quilt that we had made at one time. Anyways, there's some leftovers. So let's get started. Courthouse Steps quilt blocks. As we sew, I'll tell you a little bit about the history so you don't get bored watching me just sew. So we're going to start, these blocks in the middle are 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. I'm going to start with a gold one in the center. Normally, Courthouse Steps have a gold block in the center, traditionally. They don't have to. I'm putting one in the center. Courthouse Step blocks are a variation of a log cabin quilt block. Log cabin quilt blocks usually have a red or a gold center. I will tell you why when we do our log cabin quilt block. But because of the log cabin usually having a gold or a red center, the Courthouse usually has a gold center as well. Now all I did was I took my gold 3.5 by 3.5 inch quilt block, and I sewed it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I used a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All of the seam allowances on this block are going to be 1/4 inch, and I sewed it to another one of the 3.5 by 3.5 inch quilt blocks. Okay, so you got two of them sewn together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, I'm going to take and put, I should have told you this earlier, I was sewing right sides together. So the printed side to the printed side, I'm going to put them right sides together, right on top of one another. I'm going to line them up really well. I should have told you that when I had started instead of just talking. And I'm going to sew along right here, right along the edge, 1/4 inch seam allowance to join these two together. So here we go, 1/4 inch seam allowance, all the way down, top to bottom. Cut my thread. And then I've got this little unit right here to show you. So this is the center of our block. That's the center part right here. So we've got it. The middle part all ready to go. We've done our center part. So what we just sewed was this part right here. Okay, easy enough. Now, normally I would take this over and I would press it really well. But because my room's in the basement and everything's kind of spread around, I'm just gonna put this off to the side, and I've already done one that is already pressed for us. So let's pretend I took this over and gave it a really good pressing, and I'm just gonna show you the back side. Normally when I press fabrics, I press to the dark side. On this one, I was in a little bit of a hurry and I pressed to the light side. There's no right or wrong way to press. People have big feelings about it. Whatever way you've been taught and that you love, you go with that. Some people say you should always press your seams open. I don't press my seams open. I usually press towards the darker fabric because you can tend to see through the lighter fabric. And especially where this is backlit with my sewing machine, you can really see how sometimes you can see through that lighter fabric. Anyways, personal preference. I pressed this really good, and now I am ready to move on to the next part. The next portion is I'm going to take these, your next set of blocks. Hey Deb, how are you? I miss your face. Okay, I'm going to take and I'm going to put right sides together, my next strip, and I don't have my paper with me. I think these ones are 6.5 inches. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I think these ones are the 3.5 by 6.5. I think they go 3.5 by 3.5, 3.5 by 6.5, 3.5 by 9.5, and 3.5 by 15.5, if I remember right. So I think these are the 3.5 by 6.5. I'm going to lay it down, and I'm weird. I like directional prints to go the right way, and in my mind, this print needs to go the way that I'm holding it, the way that you can see it. So I'm just going to make sure that when I lay it right sides together, I kind of line it up, say, yep, that's how I want it, and then I just flip it over right on top. So I've got right sides together, and I'm going to sew it up right sides together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I sew a lot with my sister-in-law, and she pins everything, and I know pinning is best practice. Pinning is always best practice. I, however, do not pin anything. The very first quilt class I went to, the woman told me this awful story about her sister-in-law swallowing a pin and getting it stuck in her throat and going to the emergency room. And since then, I don't pin anything. Because I know I'd be one of those people that keeps my pins in my mouth. I don't pin anything. But if you're a pinner, it would be great to pin all the way down. Hello, Rebecca. I miss your face too. All right, I've got the first set all sewn together, right sides together, and then when you open them up, I've got my print going the right direction. That makes me happy. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to lay my top 6.5 by 3.5 piece right sides together. I always just look at it to make sure it's going the right way. And then I flip it over, right sides together, line it up nicely. Again, if you want to pin away. Like I said, I'm not a pinner, so I just kind of, as I'm sewing through, just keep readjusting it, making sure that everything is lined up nice and straight and tight. I kind of put tension on it with my fingers and use my fingers for the pins. Not saying that's the right thing to do. That is not best practice. That's just quilting according to Liz. I should have probably introduced myself. I don't know if there's people on. I know that there's the group of my quilty friends that are on here watching. You guys know who I am. If you are new to quilting with Eagle Mountain Art Alliance, my name is Liz Evans, and I have lived in Eagle Mountain for, good grief, almost 4 years now. And I love sewing and quilting. And I am really excited that we've started an annual quilt show. And if you're quilters out there that haven't put quilt in our quilt show, I will find you and I will make you put quilts in our quilt show. Okay, this is all done. So we've got the top and we've got the bottom. Again, this is where I would go over and give it a nice pressing. But for time and so you don't see me getting up and down, I have already made one that's nice and pressed and ready to go for us. So again, you can see I've just pressed the seams out to make it nice and flat. Now, while I do skip steps like pinning, I never skip the step of pressing, because pressing is what gives your quilts nice crisp edges, and so I never skip the step of pressing. I might skip the step of pinning, and I might fudge sometimes on how much yardage and stuff you should use to get as much fabric as I can out, but I don't ever skip on the pressing. Oh, I should tell you what I'm doing. Okay, so I've got my piece right here that's done. So now I'm going to take another one of my 6.5 by 3.5 pieces, and I'm going to lay it right sides together along vertically along the side, and we are going to sew this baby up. Again, 1/4 inch seam allowance, top to bottom. Again, if you're a pinner, pin away. Now I said I chose the Courthouse Steps block for our first community quilt because Courthouse Steps kind of came about in the late 1860s. In the early 1860s, Abraham Lincoln was a Civil War, and he enacted the Homestead Act, which led to the westward movement. A lot of people came out west, and they were so stretched out, and the place where they could gather to get information of their folks and family and what was going on back east was to meet at the courthouse, around the courthouse, around the steps, and in the middle is where they would make all of the announcements. It's also where they had weddings and marriages. Anything that was happening happened at the courthouse, and then people would gather around on the steps to hear what was going on. So I thought for our first community quilt, it would be really fun to have a Courthouse Steps block with all of us gathering around to make something nice for somebody else. So that's why I did the Courthouse Step block. Now I'm showing you this because it's finished. I did the one side. Now let's add the other side on. Same thing, easy peasy, right sides together. Right sides are the sides that's printed. So you can see the right side, wrong side. It's kind of harder to tell with the backlighting on. Right side, wrong side. So the printed colored side is your right side of your fabric. Gonna put it right sides together on the other side. We're gonna sew it up, and then I'm going to confuse you for just 1 minute. Now our community quilt, when we can all get back together, I will be collecting blocks still at City Hall. There's a little bin you can put your blocks in. And I will be sewing all those up into a quilt that we can give away to a member of our community. And I will also be collecting quilt blocks as we do our drive for quilts for the quilt show. The quilt show will not be happening in April, but when it does, I will have all of the announcements up so we can be able to get everybody to be able to participate. Okay, so we've got our sides on. Now I just need to add the top and the bottom. And like I said, I'm going to confuse you a little bit because I'm going to switch and finish up another block that I already have going. So this is the block we were working on. I'm just going to switch over. This is in the same, it's at the same amount of steps. We've got the middles, the tops, the bottoms, the sides. Now we're going to go top and bottom again, top and bottom, because this one's all pressed and ready to go, and the one I just put on the floor is not. So these are our long strips. Now in the instructions, it says, and again, I will link to the instructions when I'm done with this. I'll link it in the comments. In the instructions, it tells you that sometimes I cut these a little bit longer. You can cut them a little bit longer. I don't cut them longer anymore because I'm a fabric hoarder. So I'm like, oh man, I don't want to cut extra. So you don't need to cut them longer. I think I tell you to cut them, that sometimes I cut them 16.5 inches instead of 15.5 inches. You can still do that if you want. I do not do that anymore. In fact, 15.5 is going to give you a little bit of extra as well. So you'll be good to go. Sometimes it's good to have extra, especially on these last pieces, just because not everyone does a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. I don't always do a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, and everyone's 1/4 inch seam allowance, even though it says 1/4 inch seam allowance, is always just a little bit different. So this 15.5, and I will show you here at the end, is going to give you a little bit of extra fabric, a little bit of playroom, in case your seam allowances are just a little bit bigger. So I've got the top sewn on, and you can see here I have a little bit extra hanging off the end. Easy peasy, because all we're going to do is we're just going to trim those up when we're finished. So I've got the top sewn on. Now all we're going to do is sew on the bottom. Again, I'm going to take and I'm going to put right sides, here's the wrong side, right sides together, right on top of my quilt block all the way down. And I am going to just sew it up. Okay, making sure it's all nice and lined up. My edges are nice and lined up. 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Easy peasy. This is our long strip. And I think we've only been talking for just a few minutes, and we're gonna have an entire quilt block made. Again, a lot of my quilt blocks coordinate, but the beautiful thing about Courthouse steps, and another reason that I picked it, is that it doesn't matter if your fabric matches. In fact, they're super fun sometimes if they all clash. So it doesn't matter, like when we put all of our blocks together, don't worry about trying to match colors or worrying about what other people are doing. Make the quilt block that you think is awesome, and then when we get them all together, it's gonna look super cool to see everybody's personalities and styles in their own quilt blocks put together into one giant awesome quilt. Okay, 1/4 inch seam allowance sewn all the way through. Cut my thread, hold this up to show you. Kabam! All done. Easy peasy. Another great thing about these quilt blocks is that if you want to use them to make your own quilt with, all you're going to do is you're going to add sashing in between them to make your quilt. Because they're so nice and big, you don't have to make a million blocks to make a quilt. You can do 9 of them and have a really great size quilt. Super easy, super fun. And I am dying for when we're all together sewing. I think what we're hoping is that once everything calms down, that we can have set community quilting days where we can come in, we can learn some quilt blocks, and we can make some really cool quilts for our community. Let's hope that happens sooner than later. Hope you guys are all staying well, staying safe, and I will be back at noon. We'll talk about how to make a log cabin quilt block, and we'll walk you through all of the instructions on how to make that. Okay, love you guys. See you soon. Bye-bye.